wisdom or maybe to look into the future. And we've had a variety of panelists take different levels of views as to looking into the future. And my talk actually is a little bit more about the here and now with an eye toward the future. But just to suggest how radical this change is, even we can't possibly understand the full change that it will mean to take our knowledge from these physical artifacts into the digital artifacts. But here I'll give you a couple of examples if I were going to give the kind of talk that was all about that. So how many people are familiar with copyright law in this? I need to get to know the audience. How many people feel I'm very familiar with copyright law? How many people feel I'm a little bit new to copyright law? This is not, at least a few. Okay, so I'm going to cover some of the same ground that's been covered before, but I'm going to say it a little differently in a way that I hope is accessible and changes your perspective. Copyright law is generally viewed in the relationship to books as being one of these precursors to the facilitation of the production of books by creating an incentive to invest in books. But that's not the only relationship. So those familiar with copyright law, what happens if a publisher has published a book, is ready to go to market, gets sued, and the book is found to contain infringing material? If it's this kind of book, what happens to the thousands of copies? They get pulped, they get destroyed, right? Copyright law can be the facilitator of the creation of books. It can also be the source of law that can force the destruction of books. In an electronic environment, what happens to the ebook that's found to contain infringing material? You just push out an update, right? If the book has already been published and it has infringing material, the publisher can't take it back. In an electronic environment, it's possible, if the ebook is a networked piece of digital information, that it can be updated. So one of the risks of the future of the ebook is cultural stability, cultural preservation, if we think it's important to capture in a single moment, in a single document, something that's authoritatively a particular version. You can always version up history, right? I think George Orwell taught us a little bit about how the state might make use of that facility. Okay, so, but now I want to talk about the shift to the digital environment and its impact on libraries in particular. One of the things that many of us who study the shift to internet or digital environments have seen is that there are latent features in the analog world that no one paid attention to that suddenly become important in the digital environment. And what you've heard a little bit about all this privatization is in fact an example of this. Neva yesterday said that the law of copyright was tailored, it was designed for a world in which creating and distributing these kind of printed artifacts was what the goal is. And that law tailored to this production model, this distribution model, makes certain assumptions about who controls, what level of control producers and users have. And the digital environment radically shifts who's in control merely by the default of how the law reads, not because it's an affirmative policy choice that control should have been shifted. And that's what we've heard. And so as we think about this changing information environment that we're in, let me just call attention to, let's look at the relationship between publishers and libraries and the shift that happens when we move from print to digital. So in a publisher's world, the book buyer who buys this, it's hard to discriminate between selling to a library and selling to a end user consumer. Perhaps if I know that you're a library, I might charge you a different price. But I have limits as a publisher in my ability to do that because you can go around to some other retail channel if I try to charge a high institutional price. This is less true in the case of serials and periodicals where publishers very much do discriminate on price. And if you're an institution, you pay a much higher price than an individual user. But in the case of the book, that's a much more difficult thing to accomplish. So if you're trying to make money from your publishing enterprise, you have to accept in the world of print a world of roughly undifferentiated book buyers. And if you want to try to differentiate by using contracts, and you write into the book, if you are a library and you purchase this, you may only lend this book 26 times, and after that you must destroy it. As we've heard, the courts have had that kind of statement put in the book, and they've said that's not legally effective. Once you own a piece of physical property, it's yours. You can do with it what you want. We say the copyright rights have been exhausted in this copy, not in the work as a whole. And so in that world, again, the publisher cannot use contract to reach into what the purchaser is doing with the physical object. And what that means then is it's the libraries are in control of how to manage their collection of printed artifacts. So that means they decide which ones to purchase. They can decide if users, maybe it's a fragile or rare book, and so they put it in the rare book room, and only certain users are privileged to use it. You can decide whether this copy might be lent out to another library who has a user that needs it, or perhaps we're done with this collection, let's resell it and take the money to buy some new books. Uh-oh, it's getting a little destroyed. This book is actually a book called International Copyright. It's actually a soft cover book, but my law school library has wrapped a hardcover around it. Why? Because they want to preserve this for the long term, because a library, as a book buyer, has a different interest than the average consumer. The publisher published this in paperback on the assumption that people wanted the convenience of paper, but the library needs a hardcover to preserve it for the long term. And so these are all library decisions in the world of print. Now, the library also bears the cost of managing these objects, and they're, as we heard from Paul yesterday, these are expensive. $4.26 is the average price of keeping this on a shelf. These things are heavy, right? Paper is heavy, and when you put a lot of paper together, you need a lot of physical infrastructure really just hold the books up. But in terms of the relationship between publishers and libraries in the world of print, then the negotiations have a fairly small number of points on which they might negotiate. Maybe the price, and maybe how quickly you can get it if your user has asked it. And in that world, then libraries and librarians generally feel comfortable negotiating on their own behalf because there's not a lot to negotiate about. I think in the digital world, a lot has changed. So again, from the publisher's point of view, this is both an interesting and full of interesting opportunities and potential threats and challenges. And we should recognize both sides of that. But from the publisher's point of view, here are a couple of the new opportunities. You can get a lot more data about your users, their intensity of use, and you can mine that data and use that data as a way of potentially using digital technology to discriminate among your users and charge different prices for different types of users. You can also make more fine-grained control if the digital object actually is a networked object that can be updated. So maybe you want to subscribe to the ebook rather than purchase it, and then updates will be sent to you automatically. The other big change we've heard about from a number of the lawyers is that the courts, when you say you can only use this book 26 times, they say, that's not legally effective. But the minute you write that into a license agreement for a digital object, the courts are treating that as a legally effective a binding obligation on the user. That's a huge shift in control now, because it means the publisher can write the terms of use over and above what copyright law says. And that's the big change that the privatization concept has dealt with. And one of the reasons is because these digital objects have different features. You can subscribe to an ebook. So what it means from the library perspective is when publishers got out of the business of distributing printed artifacts, publishers are now in the business of selling database access. Right? In the serials and periodicals, what you do is you subscribe to a database. And that subscription can die if you stop paying, and therefore your collection goes away. There's no reason you can't do the same thing with books, right? So you might subscribe to access to a series of ebooks, And that subscription is as good as long under the terms of the contract, and if you stop paying, you lose your access to the books. And if the price is right, that from a library perspective, that may be a better deal than acquiring a copy. From the library's perspective, though, there's a lot of confusion as the publishers are trying to experiment with what the terms of use should be. And here I want to look at copyright law and contract as being closer, in a closer relationship. If the courts will enforce these contracts, then here's what I would propose the way to look at this is. Copyright law starts out as defining from the user's perspective what the terms of use are for any particular object. And then the question is, if those are the terms of use, can they be changed by the publisher? And what we've just seen is the answer in the print world was no. In the digital world, the answer so far has been yes. And some of what we've heard from some of the other speakers is, well, wait a minute, who signed on for that? Why, you know, let's make that a public policy choice. Let's not just have that happen as a result of these laws that treat the two so differently. So theoretically, this switch to digital ought to be great news from the library's perspective. It's a lot easier to store digital files than these things. It's a lot cheaper to store these. You can serve your users better. The user doesn't have to come all the way to the library to borrow this copy. I can just send you a copy over the internet and download it to your e-reader. So from that perspective, theoretically, this should be wonderful from the library's perspective. The only thing they might have to give up is the ability to resell this. It's harder to resell the digital object, and a lot of libraries relied on sort of pruning their collections, selling some things, getting the revenues to buy others. But on balance, libraries ought to welcome the digital transition. However, in the current marketplace, that's not what's happening. First of all, the digital files are all often, if not always, wrapped in some kind of digital rights management that technically limits whether you can make copies, whether you can print from the book. So I can always photocopy from this. You can't stop that. But if the technology says you cannot print, then unless you want to take screen captures, there's really no easy way to make even a fair use or fair dealing private study kind of reproduction. In addition, the publishers each get to choose which technological platform to use, and they're choosing different ones, and so there's a lack of standardization in the marketplace that's creating a lot of friction on the library's perspective. The license terms are customized by publisher, and so the library has to spend a lot of time interpreting these contracts and then enforcing them. And then often the metadata associated with these digital files is much less usable and accurate than was available for the printed object, and so that becomes a challenge as well. Okay, I'm running out of time, but I'm not making this up, right? So here's a couple of data points to suggest where the libraries are right now. Duke University Press recently did a study. It's not a completely, I wouldn't call this a statistically valid study, but it's an interesting feedback from a number of librarians who are worried about this. So we've heard that libraries want universal perpetual access, and that's certainly what we hear in this study from the librarians. What are you doing about purchasing eBooks is generally the question. And so the librarians are saying, well, we want all of this, but the vendors, the publishers are not giving us what we want. I put out my topic when Neva made the call, and I started thinking about this, and then had the happy, from my perspective, circumstance of having reality kind of bear out the thesis. So my suggestion was that libraries have not been paying enough attention to the contracts they're signing with respect to eBooks they're buying, and that my thesis here is that they need to spend more time and attention making sure the terms of those contracts are fair. And then lo and behold, libraries in the United States had an unhappy surprise in March when the publisher HarperCollins recently started enforcing a term of the contract that said that the ebook has to time out after 26 uses, right? So the contract said you can only lend this 26 times and then destroy it or disable it. And how have the librarians responded? Well, according to one librarian, they felt gobsmacked, which is an Australian term for hit upside the head, right? And well, why weren't they weren't reading the contract? Who thought when you bought a book that it would have this sort of timeout provision in it, because they were used to buying these things in a world in which once you bought it, it's yours, you have control over it. We're not in that world anymore. And so librarians have to accept that for right now, legislators and courts are willing to accept that the world has radically shifted and that they don't need to do anything to change the fact that digital resources get treated legally quite differently than analog resources. So what to do? In this conference, we've basically heard three different kinds of response. So one is public policymakers need to intervene, need to reset the terms of use for the digital environment through statutory rules about use that would not be able to be overridden by contract. So these would be a public negotiation in a public forum between rights holders and users, and once that deal is done, that's the deal. No more customization by contract. And we haven't heard, though, under that deal whether the digital rights management would also be regulated or not. If you're not regulating the technology, you haven't fully set the terms of the deal. Alternatively, we just heard from Lucy that maybe we should do a private negotiation, but a collective negotiation, so that the level of compromise would still be at a very general level. Publishers wouldn't be in the world of customizing their license terms. They'd have to get together and agree to one set of terms, and the users would do the same. Or we can live in the world we exist in now, which is publishers can experiment with their business models, and users can either accept the terms or not, or be surprised by the terms that they've accepted because they didn't realize that they've done that. And certainly from the rights owner's perspective, you hear that this is what we need. We need the flexibility and the freedom to find our business model. The pressure on us is that we need a market. If our terms are too overreaching, the discipline is that users will simply not buy it. And so we will allow us the flexibility to try out different contracts, try out different technologies, and don't get the public order in process. Like many of the other democratic idealists, I think there is a case to be made that a public policy response would be appropriate. But for this talk, I want to be a political realist, and I want to suggest that I think it's unlikely that legislators will think that there's a pressure point in the environment right now that causes them to intervene. And if they were to intervene, I'm not sure that we wouldn't get a situation that Till just said, where you get this statutory limitation and exception, it gets watered down to a point where it doesn't do the real work that the users need it to do, and they end up going into a private negotiation anyway. So I think we're in a world of private negotiation between libraries and publishers, and we're going to be in that world for a while. And if you accept that premise, then here at least are my sort of takeaways for the librarians in the audience. The first thing you have to recognize is in this world where private negotiation will define the terms of use, there are many more deal points to be negotiated than there were with respect to this. And if you're in that world, then you know, the libraries are first facing, well, am I buying books in a bundle, or am I buying them a la carte? Am I buying access to a database, or am I buying single titles? When I'm buying it, how long do I get to use it? Do I own the copy forever and ever and ever, or is it 26 uses, or is it a subscription, and as long as I pay, I have access to these are all the different models that are being experimented with. What about access rights? Yesterday we heard about publishers who are experimenting with print all, print some, no printing, copy all, copy some, no copying. These are all enforced digitally, but they're also imposed as part of the contractual relationship. Who are the eligible borrowers for the book? Can you email the book? You know, can you distribute the book over the network, or must the borrower come into the library and physically bring their e-reader in? And all of these are use issues that are being defined by contract in the world that we're in. And the user rights in this world are being defined by the contract without regard to what the limitations and exceptions would have provided. And so when you think about the long view, this is where I think in the world of print, the difference motivations for the library as a book publisher as opposed to the end user as a consumer were not very well differentiated because the publisher couldn't differentiate. And therefore the library had the freedom to exercise their different sort of role as a book publisher, as a cultural memory institution, without the need to negotiate over that. But now you do, if that is the purpose of buying the book, libraries do have a different need to negotiate different terms than the end user consumer. And so it's my argument here that libraries should focus on this difference and should focus on what they need out of the deal to fulfill their mission, and then they should negotiate for those basic principles that they need, because they won't be the same terms that you'll find in the end user contract for the consumer. And I think in a world where the terms of the deal are up for grabs, they're under negotiation, I think libraries need to accept that they should invest in this more money and more time and more effort in these negotiations than they used to. And frankly, it's not self-serving, but I think having legal advice in those negotiations is valuable. I think the lawyers would be well served. I'm sorry, yes, the lawyers would clearly be well served. But I think libraries also would be well served to actually hire a lawyer to help negotiate the terms of access to eBooks, and to think about, are there deal points at which you simply cannot compromise? Is the idea that an ebook will only be useful 26 times, if that doesn't fulfill the mission of a long-term preservation strategy or mission, then just say, sorry, we're not buying ebooks. We'll wait, and as part of the experimentation, we'll just sit on the sidelines until you offer us some terms that we're willing to live with. Or be less passive and come up with a library contract that says these are the terms we think are fair for access to. So the publisher brings their contract, the library brings their contract, you bring your lawyer, we'll bring our lawyer, let's work, right? If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But libraries don't think that way, but I think if they don't, they sort of enter this new environment with their hands tied behind their back. And if you think the legislators or the courts are going to help, as a political realist, I think that's the wrong place to put your attention. The place is in this marketplace right here, right now, in these negotiations. And it requires a change in thinking, a change in strategy. But if you don't, then you're on the sidelines, and the publisher experimentation is what you're going to live with. So those are my main takeaways. The only other one is think about the long term. Accept that publishers are fearful and uncertain in the short term, and consider being willing to agree to perhaps more restrictive terms of use for a certain period of time, but then think about the longer term. Why not have as part of the contract that the use rights expand and open up over time as the commercial value of the book declines? Anticipate that we'll still have orphan type issues because copyright law lasts for so long, and negotiate with that long view. So those are my sort of quick takeaways. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't, professors shouldn't continue to make the democratic idealistic arguments about balancing interests in the public law, but in the private marketplace, libraries need to sort of think about their role, arm themselves with lawyers, and get in there and help set the terms. Thank you very much. Okay, and I asked for a brief indulgence. This video has been mentioned. So on the plane over, I spoke with the gentleman next to me, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I told him about the conference, and he said, "Oh yeah, my wife, she's really loves ebooks. She has this Sony Nook, but then I just got her this tablet. It's an Android tablet, and I'm sorry to say, Simon, that the Android is not working that well for her." And she's having trouble, and so we've heard about this. Okay.
Is this your use?
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, in Israel, it's actually allowed by law for educational purposes. You can make this public.
So this is the video that we heard about in the opening session and was referred to again. And since Fania gave us this wonderful history of the book presentation this morning, this is a Norwegian comedy skit about how the monks had to deal with the codex when this new technology was first developed. And my conversation on the plane suggested that we're in a current moment. So this is the monk who calls for the help desk to come help him with his technological problem. Uh-oh. Do you not have sound? Where's the speaker? It's Norwegian anyway. You can't understand it. Thank you for the indulgence. I like that little
Okay, we're going to give him a Hebrew book next and then get him completely confused. Okay, so our next speaker is Simon Morrison, Copyright Communications and Policy Manager in Google London. So, Google, take.
Afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure to listen to all of these very eminent speakers on the subject of intellectual property. Today I'm going to talk a bit about Google's approach to these issues. I'm going to start by talking about the commercial landscape and why we're involved, and then at the end I'll make some proposals, basically laying out what our position is on the best way to encourage access both commercially and to publicly available works. I might make two comments before starting. One, we're great lovers of Europeana, and in fact, our partners can include their books in Europeana. And two, I wanted to bracket off the Google book settlement. Happy to answer any questions about it. But as we are, so for background for those who don't know, we scan in copyright books in our library partnerships in the United States. We were sued for this practice by a group of authors and publishers. We reached a settlement And that settlement was recently rejected by the judge. So now both parties are figuring out what comes next. So I will answer your questions, but I'm likely to simply say, we thought it was a good idea. We're seeing what happens next. Okay. So a question, can everybody hear me, by the way? Is that, so a question I get asked a lot is why is Google involved in all of these things? Why are we involved in culture? And our traditional answer has been, we want to make all the world's information accessible and blah, 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 blah. And people tend to shake their heads, expecting some ulterior motive behind it. So if I'm to lay out what the self-interest is, I will paraphrase our chief economist who says, there are two ways that a company can grow. You can either take more of the pie or grow the pie. And our approach is to grow the pie. That is to increase the amount of activity, both commercial and other, online, right? And we found that, one, that pleases our users. Two, hopefully it leads people to sue us a bit less. So to talk a bit about the landscape that exists online now, we think it has potential for a great many players, right? Now, we've seen the phenomenon of people becoming stars because it's much easier to find a wide audience online than it was in the previous era. And these are some examples of those. But the internet is also providing opportunity for more established players. So you see that statistic there, 35 hours of content are uploaded to YouTube every minute. But increasingly, we also have a lot of professional content on YouTube from movie studios, record companies, and other players. And they've found that YouTube is providing them opportunity both by both marketing, finding audiences, and having links to sell their works through iTunes, Amazon, and others, and through a system we call Content ID. So we spent approximately $30 million to build this system in which if you have a movie, say, you can give us the reference files, and then we will constantly scan the site for your film, and then we will follow your instructions. You have three options. Either we will take it down every time we find it, we will simply report it to you that it's been uploaded, or we will do what they call monetize, a bad word. Basically, we'll put ads up against the video, and we'll share the revenue. And the vast majority of partners choose to make money. So it's a good solution for them. So basically, if I take a step back, our approach is that we want to use the power of the internet to help cultural workers who are creating new things today, unknown stars as well as established stars, as well as to preserve and provide access to our shared culture in the form of public domain works in a lot of different forms. So this doesn't simply cover books, but for example, we work with museums around the world in what we call the Art Project, which some of you may have seen, in which we produce these super high-res scans of images in some of the world's major museums so that it's possible for you sitting in Tel Aviv to see a major work in the Prado Museum in Madrid, for example. So that's kind of our approach. These are just some stats about our content partners. We're working with people across a wide number of industries to increase the commerce online. And this has to do with piracy. It's become it's become a bit of a commonplace to say, and I think it's true that part of the problem with piracy is that you're not seeing enough legal services emerge. And later in the talk, I'll get to some of the legal levers we think governments should pull in order to enable more of these legal services to emerge. And we do focus some on the protection side by having good practices when it comes to notice and takedown and other elements of preventing privacy. However, we think it's really important to get the positive side right and to make it easy for people to legally access works and pay for works. Now, to get specific with Google Books, we launched the Google Google eBooks in the United States. Usually people complain that I'm being too loud, so this is a novel experience. We launched Google eBooks in the United States last year, and we're planning to expand that internationally this year and in 2012 as well. And Google eBooks, we work with publishers and with individual authors if you're a self-published author, and they can sell their works because we see great opportunity in the world of ebooks. There are two sources for Google Books, a traditional product in which you can go to the site and search books and read some of them. We get the books from two sources. To some of you, this will be fairly old hat, but from our library partners, of which there are 43 around the world and 12 in Europe, we sign contracts with them. They decide which of their works they want us to digitize, and then we digitize them. We give the libraries a copy of the scans. They're available through Google Books. You can search the full text of the book. You can download the public domain works. And I should say that outside of the United States, we only digitize public domain works in our library partners, from our library partners. And then from publishers, we have more than 35,000 publisher partners globally. They use Google Books, the original site, as a marketing tool. There are links to third-party retailers on the site where you can then go and buy from Amazon and the like. And then in the future, people will buy directly from Google eBooks outside of the United States, as well as from small publishers who will be able to sell ebooks, or small booksellers, excuse me, who will be able to sell ebooks themselves as well. So the digital marketplace is booming. That might be a bit of hyperbole, but it's certainly on the up and up. And we think there's great potential, and we're working in this area on a number of things. I haven't shown you any images of, for instance, Google Music Beta, which we announced a week ago, which is a music locker service. Amazon announced their own music locker service. We're also doing movie rentals through YouTube and other content services. Over the next year or so, you're going to see a lot more of this from Google. And we think that the cloud offers a great deal of opportunity, and it's something that we're good at and that we can work with our content partners on. Now, to get to the meat, what needs to change to enable more of this to happen? So we want to protect the idea of intermediary liability limitation. You saw the slide before where I said that 35 hours of content is uploaded to YouTube every minute. Pre-screening would be impossible, and imposing greater liability on intermediaries would dampen the creation of new platforms, which are to the benefit of content creators. Forgive the term. Flexible exceptions. So we believe you need to have exceptions that allow for new technologies heretofore unseen. Fair use has been quite successful in this way. We did some research in preparation for the recent UK IP law review. We commissioned a study with venture capitalists and small and medium-sized businesses to see what problems they faced when it came to copyright law. And it came through loud and clear from the venture capitalists that they simply wouldn't invest in a regime where there was the kind of uncertainty that you would see in, basically in most of Europe, where new technologies exist in a gray area when it comes to the existing menu of exceptions. So we think you need to have flexible exceptions that allow for new innovation to see the birth of these new products and services. Efficient licensing regimes. I could talk for a while on this. I'll just mention the example, for instance, of licensing music in Europe, which is extremely difficult. It's not transparent. You don't know frequently what it is that you've licensed because you're not given the list of the repertoire. And the collecting societies act in quasi-monopolies in each country, and it's difficult to get to license on a pan-territory basis, something which Lucy discussed with respect to books. And then orphan works. So we think on the point of orphan works, we would favor both legislative and technological solutions. So a registry, setting up a registry in order to reduce the number of orphans generally by allowing people to come forward and claim works and to make themselves known would be a good thing. And then a collective rights management scheme to allow businesses and public institutions to license these works would also be very useful. And then essentially, with support, we're not dogmatic about how you solve this problem, and we will engage with the process in Europe that's ongoing, or promised anyway. But essentially, we think that you need to limit risk for private and public players, allow both public and private players to operate, and this is quite important. I'll digress a moment by saying earlier this year, Europe commissioned a Comité des Sages report. It's usually translated as the Wise Men Committee in English, which has a horrible archaic sound, so we'll stick with Comité des Sages. But they said they essentially recommended that Europe promote more public-private partnership because they recognize the cost involved in digitizing works, and saw that it would only really be possible if you allow a wide swath of players to participate. We think you need to make clear when a diligent search is done. We would propose, for instance, consult a database, publicize your desire to use a work for a limited time and call that done, and then report orphans to the database so that that information is kept up to date. Enable rights holders to come forward if they are to be found and to claim up to a certain limit any royalties. And then you need flexibility because different types of works, books, music, film, have different requirements. Now, another thing which we haven't spoken all that much about in this conference, broader than merely orphan works, are in copyright but out of print works. By our estimate, this makes up about 75% of the books in existence. And it's a problem because these are lying dormant. The writers are not benefiting, nor the publishers, and readers don't have access to them aside from the few extant copies. So late last year, Google signed a memorandum of understanding with Hachette, the French publisher, in which we agreed that we would help them identify their out-of-print stock list based on our scanning of their in-copyright works in the US. And this is a problem. Lots of publishers don't know exactly what they have that's out of print. We would use those scans and sell them through Google eBooks in a revenue share agreement, essentially extending their commercial life.